This book is about to blow your mind.
More specifically, the two hemispheres of your mind.
Because The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist is an examination of the right and left hemisphere and how they not only impact your day-to-day life, but how they form the society as a whole.
As two non-neuroscientists, it's time to talk about neuroscience. I'm Robert.
I'm Asher, and this is Learning to Live. The book we are talking about today, The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist, is insane.
Yeah, that was a lot.
It's a lot, and we're only halfway through it.
Oh my gosh.
A long
Feels
way
like
to
year
go.
of going through this book.
This took a while. This episode is being recorded a little later than we originally anticipated. It'll still come out in the weekly flow, but just in the week because it took so long to get through the first half of this book. Now, if you've never heard of this book, you're in the right place because we are going to be your dumb interpreters for the next hour.
We're not going to be giving you the best breakdown. This is two guys who don't have a background in neuroscience.
Yes.
Reading this book.
Exactly. So it's good because hopefully we can take the core points and what we value and how this loops back into our mission of the podcast. Mm-hmm. But it's a lot of information and a lot of words that I don't necessarily know.
Big vocabulary.
Big words.
But yeah, I mean, hopefully we don't completely miss the point or misinterpret anything from this book. I mean, there's a lot of very interesting studies, but there's also so many pieces moving around at the same time of this might not necessarily be important for our reality because it's only in schizophrenic people. We'll get into kind of the details of that, but there's some really interesting concepts and ideas that I did feel related to our other podcast stuff. So it'll be interesting to get into those. And
this book it's mind-blowing because, like you said, it ties together a lot of the things that we have been talking about. It's fantastically written, and it really, some of the stuff, you're like, whoa. It's just so cool, and it's so interesting, and it's so related to how we process things, to how we approach the world, to how the world is the way it is. Mm-hmm. So that all said, what is The Master and His Emissary? Yeah,
so this book basically kind of breaks down the key differences in our hemispheres, our brain hemispheres, and kind of why they're different and the significance of their difference. It kind of addresses that this idea throughout a lot of history that people have thought of the right hemisphere as being the dumb or the minor hemisphere, but it makes a very strong case for why it's actually not that way.
Right.
And so part one of the book, which is what we've read, goes through a lot of the kind of neuroscience behind it, and then also the why and the how it's developed this way. And then part two gets a lot into the how that's kind of shaped history using his model. That is going to be, a whole different beast that we're going to tackle in a later episode. So I think one thing we're going to try to do this episode, which we haven't done before, is kind of read out passages from the book to give us a little grounding for our conversation so the audience isn't completely lost, because I highly doubt a lot of our 10 viewers have read this book because I know most of them. They have not read the book.
Right.
And so it gives a little, basis for where we're coming from.
Yeah. And this way, we don't have to provide as much summary, and you can just...
Because we're not going to do as good of a job explaining it as he does.
But this way, you know what we're talking about, and we can really link it back to what we want to... the conversation we want to have.
Yeah.
So welcome to story time.
All right. First story time on Learning to Live.
Okay. So the first context we're going to give is why the book is actually called The Master and His Emissary. And this is me reading his version of a story by Nietzsche. There's a story in Nietzsche that goes something like this. There was once a wise spiritual master who was the ruler of a small but prosperous domain, and who was known for his selfless devotion to his people. As his people flourished and grew in number, the bounds of his small domain spread, and with it, the need to trust implicitly the emissaries he sent to ensure the safety of its ever more distant parts. It was not just that it was impossible for him personally to order all that needed to be dealt with, as he wisely saw, he needed to keep his distance from and remain ignorant of such concerns. And so he nurtured and trained carefully his emissaries, in order that they could be trusted. Eventually, however, his cleverest and most ambitious visor, the one he most trusted to do his work, began to see himself as the master, and used his position to advance his own wealth and influence. He saw his master's temperance and forbearance as weakness, not wisdom, and on his missions on the master's behalf, adopted his mantle as his own. The emissary became contemptuous of his master, and so it came about that the master was usurped, the people were duped, the domain became a tyranny, and eventually it collapsed in ruins. Ooh, just chills.
Yeah.
So, what is the key takeaway? How is that going to link us to the rest of this book?
Yeah, so this kind of gets us, I guess, a little glimpse into the ideas proposed by this book, which is very philosophical in nature. These kind of two different worldviews that the hemispheres bring to us, where it's like the right hemisphere has got a little more of the kind of worldly, spiritual, kind of holistic view. And the left hemisphere brings this kind of like approach where it thinks it knows everything and it feels very confidently that it's right, but it's really only the emissary, not the master. And when it tries to take control of us, it ultimately leads us into ruin.
Yes. It's really this philosophical book as well as breaking down the science. And we haven't gotten to the philosophical part as much, but he started to hint at how this is leading us down as a society to this path. Because, like you said, the left hemisphere only has part of the picture. And yet it is confident that it knows exactly what's going on. It's confident that it knows the answers to these questions. And it has the language behind our thoughts that we're going to get into. So it heavily dictates our perception and how we communicate with each other. And it's beginning to basically usurp the master.
Yeah. We're going to get into a lot more details soon. But I think before we get there, it's important to think, why is this important? Why is this necessary for this podcast? Why did we choose this book?
Yeah. And I think we said this at the end of the last episode, but we're really interested in themes that bridge the gap between different schools of thought. So I think we're both naturally interested in the fact that across the world, there pops up all these different almost theories for existence of how to be alive and how to live, right? We read the Untethered Soul and it tells you to let go. Or we read Deep Work and it tells you how to achieve economic success through intense focus. Or, we just read Good Energy and it's this whole plan for diet. And we're going to get into exercise and stoicism and there's religion. And so kind of across all this, people are having really profound experiences and there seems to be similarities amongst them all. And the goal of this podcast, as we try and learn what fulfillment is and learn meaning on this deeper level, is how can we take some of the learnings from all these different places? How can we bridge these gaps and get more of a unifying idea of how we should approach life? And so this book specifically really called our names because it does take some of the science of the brain, some of the observation that we know to be true, and links it with the spiritual, links it with the philosophical, so that these concepts don't just now exist in isolation. We can understand what's going on, why people are having spiritual experiences, why this is working.
Yeah.
And begin to bridge that gap.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We kind of have like our projected list of a lot of topics that we've brainstormed before. And I know that I was thinking really cool topics to cover is, things like how music impacts us, how language impacts us, how focus and attention that we've already kind of touched on. And already in this book, it's already hit on like all of these and more, and spirituality. So it's very interesting how it's tying it all into our brains. And that seems like it matters a lot.
And it's cool because I've never thought about my own brain or my own thought process through the lens of the divide between the left and right hemisphere.
Yeah.
I knew they existed as two different hemispheres, and that's literally about it.
Yeah.
And, I think I knew on some level that the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body and the right hemisphere the left, but never did I realize that there was this fundamental, not only divide, but kind of collision and clash and disagreement for how to go about things. And the balance between the two is almost like this yin and yang. And as it's getting out of balance, it could be the root of a lot of catastrophic issues.
Yeah. Yeah, so this book gets into the key differences, right? And the way that he does this is he basically uses so many studies for so long. I mean, the notes section of this
It's
book,
like the last 60 pages are just like citations.
right? A lot of these are from studies from people with like brain injuries or abnormal brains. So either damages in the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, or split brain patients who they used to do this surgery on people back in the olden days in like the 1900s, where they would like sever the bridge between the hemispheres, which is called the corpus callosum.
Nice.
And they would do this to treat like epilepsy and also
Right.
I think maybe schizophrenia. And
Maybe.
yeah,
Sure, why not?
sure. If it's not,
Doesn't matter. We're not here to be completely right.
right. And so it was a treatment for a disease. And
Yeah.
then they would do a lot of tests on these people because like the right side of their body would operate via only what the left hemisphere knows and vice versa. So a lot of very interesting stuff comes out of that. So given that, none of these studies, as far as I know, are on like regular people, but they were able to somehow deactivate parts of the hemispheres to do tests on people,
Yes.
which is kind of crazy to me that we
Yeah.
can just turn off part of the brain.
I would never sign up for that study.
and that nothing goes wrong. Well, in like long term.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of how most of this science is kind of brought about. And it's an overwhelming amount of research that gets brought into this. That's frankly way more than I cared to really know. So we listen to most of this on like Audible, and the second chapter is like 3.5 hours of just going over every detail of how the hemispheres are different.
Yeah.
We sat through 3.5. We ultimately sat through, I think it was over 12.
It's 14 hours was the first half.
And
we have 14 hours to go.
Yeah. So we had 14 hours of
Yeah.
listening to this.
Yeah.
And it's an insane amount of information. And now, so we can't talk about all of that.
No.
And we're going to do a terrible job if we even try. So let's try.
Yeah. And I think we've already said it, but it's important to restate both hemispheres pretty much do everything. And he brings up
with each other. It's very interconnected.
They're very interconnected. And so as he draws out these differences, it's easy to feel like, oh, the right brain does this, the left brain does this. But he really is careful to nuance the fact that both hemispheres are heavily involved with most processes.
Mm-hmm.
The main difference is how they go about these processes.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's get into how they go about these processes.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we have two sections here, and these are not too long. So we're going to talk about them and give our reaction.
The one that matters.
The one that matters. I believe the essential difference between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere is that the right hemisphere pays attention to the other, whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, with which it sees itself in profound relation. It is deeply attracted to and given life by the relationship, the betweenness that exists with this other. By contrast, the left hemisphere pays attention to the virtual world that it has created, which is self-consistent but self-contained, ultimately disconnected from the other, making it powerful but ultimately only able to operate on and to know itself.
So basically,
break that down for us.
All right. So I think what this is getting at, right?
Here we go.
Is this idea that basically the right side of our brain interprets everything in context in relationships to one another, versus the left hemisphere is a lot more analytical and sees things extracted from the context in parts. It's like the whole versus the parts. And that matters. And it matters because whenever we break things into the parts, they become kind of lifeless and mechanical. And there's a lot of weird stuff in there where he talks about how the left brain prefers like man-made things, which is really weird to me that that's baked into our brains.
Right.
But it is, I guess. And so the idea that we have conflicting worldviews where one's like kind of particular, lifeless, and analytical, whereas the other one's kind of sees the picture all at once and has emotion. It has like a kind of unexplainable way of appreciating and understanding the world. And it's important to note that the language, like our thoughts and what we can actually interpret, is in the left side of our brain. And so the left side of the brain only deals with what it knows, and that's where our thoughts come from, which will be very important. I'm sure we'll talk about this in length soon. But it's interesting because I never would have considered that my brain has two different ways of seeing the world, and that only one of them can generate thoughts that I can understand.
Yeah. He comes back to this reoccurring theme that things tend to start in the right hemisphere, go to the left hemisphere, and then come and get reintegrated by the right hemisphere. So in this context specifically, here's how I'm imagining it. It's you look at something and the right hemisphere just absorbs the entire thing and the context of which it exists in. And then the left hemisphere comes in and it breaks it up. It starts labeling things, categorizing things. But these are kind of crude categories. They're not meant to get the essence of the thing. They're meant to be categorical in a way that is consistent and repeatable and familiar. And then once you have a better sense through the left hemisphere of the categories of things, it kind of gets reintegrated into the whole. That knowledge gets reintegrated by the right hemisphere. This starts to bring about an issue when you get too left hemispheric, right?
And this is the idea of the emissary usurping the master.
Right. It's great to be able to categorize things, but you're missing this deeper context. You're missing the relationship of the observer with the subject itself. And so things like jokes and things like metaphors can only be understood by the right hemisphere because that requires a richness of context and a richness of experience, while the left hemisphere only cares about like sets of facts that it can group.
Yeah, and it's important to note that it does have like an idea of what a fact is, and it believes in facts. And that does not mean that they're real at all. And so it kind of comes up with its own set of rules and facts that it then applies to the world. And that can be very misleading.
Yeah. The way I would demonstrate this, I think he says in the book at one time, if you were to say like, oh, who is this person in your life? Like name, like who is John? And you say, well, he's a 5'11" guy. He has brown hair. He wears these types of shoes. He was born in California. It's like that. Okay, you could continuously categorize him into these snippets, which is what the left hemisphere would do. But you're not getting at who is John. Like you don't know who he is, and it's almost this difference of the living versus the not living. It's like as if you were to describe a corpse or just a body as just an object, as opposed to the life behind the thing.
Yeah,
and the life lives with the right hemisphere, and just the facts live with the left.
Right. So before we really get into some of the more, I guess, detailed whys and why it matters, let's finish laying out some of the groundwork here with our second section of kind of a little high-level overview of the differences that he gives.
Yeah. So here is our last bit of information.
Before we get into more information.
before we really break down the meaning for our own lives and start to give, the relevance to this podcast, right? If one had to encapsulate the principal differences in the experience mediated by the two hemispheres, their two modes of being, one could put it like this. The world of the left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, disembodied, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, always imperfectly known, and to this world it exists in a relationship of care.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And I won't.
Won't even try.
Won't even give it a shot. Now, this is, again, really breaking out this like living versus non-living. But it also gets to a really important part that we might not have mentioned, which is the left hemisphere is really concerned with manipulating the world and control. And so what it does is through language and through like this tokenization of the world around us, this categorization, it represents the world in thought so that it can manipulate it, so that it can make things happen, reach the ends to the mean.
Yeah. It's basically like the right hemisphere deals with like what is and just the raw, unfiltered life around us. And then the left hemisphere takes it and breaks down all these things and represents it to our brain as these kinds of ideas of things instead of the actual things themselves.
Right.
And this is a very important distinction to make because a lot of our experience can just be of ideas of things instead of actually things.
So taking this concept and applying it to what we've learned so far in the podcast, because we did a 3-part series on Michael Singer's philosophy of meditation and the inner voice in our head and where that comes from. What to you might have been the bridge there? And like, was there any major connections and themes we can draw forward?
I think this book has so many connections that's really been kind of mind-blowing to learn about as we've gone. It seems like there's been so many just instances in here where it feels like, wow, is that what's actually happening? Because it's hard to know with the book how, our hemispheric differences, what that actually translates to in our real life. Because I'm like, man, this dude seems really right-brained.
Right.
Because it seems like the right hemisphere almost acts as a lot of what Michael Singer would call like the spiritual heart, or kind of this place from where his inspiration comes from, this kind of like doing without thinking, where he's able to write and code and do miraculous work without having thoughts about it. And then also he talks a lot about, just being in the world, just experiencing things without judgment. Sounds a lot like experiencing what is, not our ideas of what is, and not labeling and judging things. So no, I don't know exactly, it'd be curious to see what his brain and how his activations
brains
work.
get a Michael Singer.
It's just one giant,
just doesn't have a left hemisphere.
It's just one giant right hemisphere. But I think that it makes me very curious as to, a couple episodes ago when we were doing our meditation research, I would love to look more into this and see, because he mentions a lot of parts of the brain in here that a lot of them I was like, I've read that before.
Yeah.
In our other previous understanding, but it's not all, a right hemisphere thing. A lot of it is actually changing things in your left hemisphere.
Right.
So this could be inhibiting things or suppressing things, or just changing the structures within your left hemisphere, which can then either, I don't know if it gives way more to the right, or if it just suppresses things in the left hemisphere that are then suppressing things in the right, because that's another topic that he talks about a lot in the book, is the left hemisphere actually actively suppresses and inhibits activity in the right hemisphere.
Yeah. One of the light bulb moments I had was Michael Singer literally says at one point, when he's introducing this idea of the voice in our head, he says, when you see something, notice what that voice is doing. It's commenting on it. It's describing it. Like, why is it doing that? And he gives this example. He says, imagine you're walking in the cold and you're walking home and you say, man, in your head, you're saying, man, I'm really cold, but I'm almost home soon. I'm right around the corner, right? He said, why are you saying all these things in your head? It doesn't change the fact that you're cold. It doesn't change how close you are to being home. What does it do? It gives you this sense of control. It gives you this feeling like, okay, I can handle this. And what he's saying is that voice is recreating the outside world in our mind into a virtual world that we can now manipulate and control. That's exactly what the left hemisphere does, is it recreates the world into a controllable world in our mind. And what the right hemisphere does, just taking in the whole, that's what Michael Singer says we should aspire to. Like, imagine you could just, this is the whole just tree story that we talked about. Imagine you could just look at something without judgment, without commentary, and just experience it.
Yeah.
And that would be the right hemisphere. So to me, it's like, whoa, like there are these two different ways of going about things in your brain. And it's literally like a divide.
Yeah. And it's, I totally, I was thinking through this book, I was like, should I just remove the left hemisphere? Right?
Yes.
Is this important?
The same
but
thought.
It actually is very important, and also can it's hugely important for facilitating, I think, spirituality, because he talks about 5 different types of attention that I guess are the kind of like accepted amongst the neuroscientists.
Those scientist people.
the people who are way smarter doing cool things. You basically have vigilance, sustained attention, alertness, focused attention, and divided attention. And now the first 3 are all in the right hemisphere, and those deal with kind of your intensity of focus. And they're basically around like interacting with the outside world. Vigilance is like taking in what's new. Sustained attention is, I think, persisting through time, more or less. Alertness is, being able to like responsive. And then divided attention, I don't really. I think that's just being able to attend to two things at
Sure.
once. Or that is in both hemispheres, and then focus attention is in your left, and that's the one where you can kind of like pick out and isolate and really hone in on certain things. And that seemed to be a very key factor in meditation. And I thought that was interesting. And I was like, I thought that would be in the right. It seems like the right does all these things, but the right is the global attention, like your peripheral and everything else that's going on that keeps you, alive and doing things. Whereas the left's kind of like the laser.
Yeah.
And so I think spirituality is this crazy mix of like embracing the globalness, but also taking the laser and like really putting it on, I guess, the good things or the right things, or just like the experiential world.
Yeah. He says at the end of chapter 2, I don't want to give the impression that we'd all be better off if we all had left hemisphere strokes. Like it's very important for a lot of things. And when it works in cooperation, it's fantastic. It's all about balance.
Yes.
Right. It's important to think about it in this way because at least when I was reading it, like you, I was getting ready to just be like, I don't want my left hemisphere doing anything.
Right.
But there are key interesting things that the left hemisphere does that sometimes he can kind of account for. Sometimes it just seems like it's crucial that it does it, which is like he says spiritual experience is likely happening in the left hemisphere. Now, that doesn't mean the right hemisphere doesn't have a big involvement into how this comes to be, but there are parts of the left hemisphere that are crucial for us to have the full scope of experience. It can't just be the right hemisphere. And I think about, the subtitle to this book is The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And when I think about things falling out of balance and I think about East versus West ideas, East is so much more about interconnectedness of the body, of spirituality, of, a lot of health is treated as a full body thing, whereas West, we're so divided. We talked about this in Good Energy. Like everything's so divided. There's
so hyper specialized.
It's so hyper specialized. And it's not that those things don't have utility. It's just that when it's too much on that side of things, we run into trouble.
Yeah, I think one thing he talks about in the book as far as why, this kind of hyper-focused, specialized view can be very misleading. It's like, look at this table. If we were to say, what's this table, we could describe the table and then it's like, well, we want to get a closer look on it. We like zoom in a little bit and we're like, okay, well, the table's made out of like whatever this wood stuff is. And they're like, well, what's this wood stuff? So we zoom in more. Like, okay, this wood stuff seems to be broken down in these. And then we keep zooming in. Eventually, it's like, we're not even seeing the table anymore. The idea of what the table is completely gone. Now we're just down in the quantum realm looking at little bits and pieces of energy.
Right.
And it's like the idea of a table no longer makes any sense.
Yeah.
And so whenever you zoom in closer and closer, you lose the picture of the whole. And that's the right hemisphere is the whole, the left hemisphere is the focused. But we need both to kind of have an understanding and ability to survive and be in the world. But then we also need to pay very close attention to our context and relationship with the things around us.
Yeah, going on to that survival aspect, he talks a lot about how the left hemisphere is more concerned with that survival, right? It's linked to grasping and to control and to manipulation. And so all things that are kind of important for the tactile, starting to kind of get what you want in the world, which was useful in a time when it was useful. But as those needs are met more and more, it over-indexes. And again, this really links to what we talked about, how with phone usage and with addiction, the survival mechanisms that used to just serve utility are now being turned against us because we're in a different culture. We're in a different society where our dopamine can now be hijacked, where sugar doesn't represent, we found like a high carb food that's going to give us energy through the winter. We can just eat as much of it until we're just really unhealthy.
Yeah.
It goes back to, the left brain really concerned with manipulation and grabbing, and it has its utility.
Yeah.
But then it leads us down a bad path in excess.
Yeah. Another thing that it does is it will, make you more familiar with things and experiences. So you kind of have that global attention wherever you're experiencing something for the first time. And it's like this, whoa, this is a new experience, right? That's your right brain deals with that. And then it shifts gradually more left brain, because then it starts to, you become more familiar, more used to it. You understand how it works. You no longer need to pay such wide attention to it. It's a lot more of a routine and familiar. And then whenever we get stuck in this routine familiar, it kind of becomes a lot more of an inherent left brain quality. And I think in a lot of our lives, we're very routine and we're very familiar with what we do. And we rarely do new things, I think, at the level at which humans used to do new things. You know, it's a lot of the same stuff. And I think that also could probably relate to kind of our suffering as far as the more time we spend in these kind of routine, left hemisphere dominated states, which these are the lifeless kind of emotionless states, you know, not great. not great for us.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that I also found this interesting that the right hemisphere has a lot more of a melancholy emotion to it as its base state, and that people,
very interesting,
like a lot more depression was found in people who had, I guess, more right brain going on than left brain. So that was interesting. The left brain is also like optimistic, you know, usually incorrectly so. And I thought there's some weird stuff going on there. I'm like, I don't really understand how these relate in the whole picture.
Yeah. And maybe he'll illuminate that in the second half, but also I don't think it's fully known yet. Like, I think it's important to understand that, like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the vibe I was getting as I was reading this is we're using these studies, like you said, on split brain patients, or when somebody has like a lesion in the left or the right brain, or has schizophrenia. And it feels like he's done a fantastic job culminating all the science you could possibly culminate to get this understanding of this approach. But the science available still is very limited in its ability to understand what's happening in the brain.
Right.
And so while he extrapolates in, I think, a really intelligent and fantastic way, he's extrapolating from simply just a limited field.
Yeah. And it's also hard, you know, he identifies the shortcomings of things like neuroimaging, which while you can see that there's a lot of activity going on in that part of the brain, activity can be inhibitory in nature. And so you're actually seeing a deactivation of something instead of an act. So it can be misleading, but you know, he tries to do a good job at covering his bases as far as this is what we have the best to know now.
Now, one of the interesting things he hones in on here, which is obviously crucially important, is the fact that language appears in the left hemisphere. And for a while, this was the reason why everyone thought the left hemisphere was the better hemisphere, was the dominant hemisphere, and that the right hemisphere on its own was kind of useless. Because if somebody had a right hemisphere stroke, they could still speak, but if they had a left hemisphere stroke, they'd lose, you know, the ability to vocalize, all these things, because language appears in the left hemisphere. But he goes on this very dissective view of why this is maybe misleading and why it's not as impactful as we thought.
Yeah, very interesting. And I've always thought about language as this very like dictates our life type of thing. And so how is the language that we know and how we use it, how does that impact our experience? So I've always been curious about this. And I don't know if anyone out there's seen the movie Arrival. That's interesting. It deals with learning an alien language that allows, I don't want to spoil it, but it's cool. This book, he talks about first the origins of language, which I thought was kind of fascinating because he says that we kind of came to language it wasn't like an evolution, natural selective pressure that kind of got us there. We kind of started with actually music and like singing or humming or whatever we used to do back in the olden days.
And I think this is still debated,
right?
But I don't know. My assumption was it was for communication. It was survival. It was, like you said, we got there for the purpose.
Turns out
not so clear.
Yeah, not so clear. And this is a little tangent here. Interestingly, we interpret music in our right hemisphere as a living thing. Thought that was interesting. You know, most other things go into the left hemisphere that are not living, and then living things are in the right, and music is in the right, and that's. Don't know what's going on there, really. It's interesting.
Yeah.
But anyways, so we develop language, right? We think that our language is like our truth and our like huge skill set. But it actually can be a very limiting thing because he keeps making this idea of you lose the funniness of the joke when you make it explicit, right? When you explain what the joke is. And language is like taking all of these really insane, implicit, internal states of being and then generating an explicit explanation for them. And it's like we're losing the life of our being through language, and where we lose the ability to understand things at a deeper level when we try to explain them.
Right. And the example I would use is if you think of, if I describe anything to you, if I describe a tree to you, by definition, you're losing something in that description. I look at a tree and I describe it to you. It's not like you just looked at the tree.
Yeah.
And it feels like it is the most powerful tool because it can be used for communication. And obviously it's powerful. Obviously there's a ton of utility with language. But it is the translator, right? And he says in the example of the translator, meaning never comes from the translator. It's just translating some meaning and trying to get that meaning across to somebody else. And no matter what, it's going to be a fraction of what it once was.
Yeah. So I think now might be a good time to get into metaphor. And he talks a lot about metaphor as this like key thing that we can do with language as kind of something that the left hemisphere can't really understand, but it's our attempt to use language to like supersede language or to go beyond what it can actually do. And he talks about poetry and metaphors, but we picked out a little paragraph here to read about metaphors.
Yeah, and he says, before I read it, I'll just say that language exists in the left hemisphere, but it is that tokenized language, that symbols of the world, that categorization. Like you said, the metaphor, the meaning, that is more actually right hemisphere.
Yeah, and the right hemisphere does kind of have a sense of language that they've been able to find, which we didn't understand before. It's just not that it can communicate it in like English or whatever.
Yeah. Metaphor.
Wow.
Nice little heading for us. Language functions like money.
Right off into metaphor.
Yeah, starting with a metaphor is perfect. It is only an intermediary. But like money, it takes on some of the life of the things it represents. It begins in the world of experience and returns to the world of experience. And it does so via metaphor, which is a function of the right hemisphere and is rooted in the body. To use a metaphor, language is the money of thought.
He's a good writer. I mean, he's a
good writer.
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to tip the cap.
Yeah, right. But this passage that really hammers home this idea that it's like our experience kind of starts on the right, goes to the left, comes back to the right. And that's what the idea of the metaphor is that our language should be kind of taking the right or taking from the right. We bring it to the left, we can explain something as a metaphor or whatever, and then it goes back to the right where it's like we can experience the meaning again. And that's like one of the, I guess, only good things our language can really do beyond survival communication does, which is a very interesting kind of take on this.
Yeah, and it goes back to the fact that context exists in the right hemisphere, right? I can look at the chair you're sitting in and I can just say, that's a chair, but it's the right hemisphere that recognizes that this is, the chair that we use for our podcast. It has all this meaning baked into it. We've recorded our first 10 episodes sitting in this chair. I got this chair from my parents who, we had it when I was a kid. Like all these things that might exist about the chair that I could the left hemisphere can just simply describe, but the context is what brings life to it. And so like money, when you're buying something or when you get paid, it's like, yeah, you're getting this piece of paper by itself. It doesn't really have any meaning, but it represents this value in what you could purchase and, what you were paid for. And so all these things get this meaning gets lumped into it. And then it becomes the thing that we communicate with, that we exchange value with.
Crazy stuff, man. He has such a beautiful way of describing things. It makes me want to like read poetry and listen to classical music.
Yeah, right?
I mean, it's like, what am I missing over here?
I know.
But
and just listening to it in my left ear so that just my right hemisphere gets.
I know. I literally looked up. I was listening to the audiobook with my right earbud in, and I was like, what's the best ear to listen to books through? It was like, your right's probably better because it goes to the left, which is the language. I'm like, but do I want to have the narrow view or the global view? Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It
doesn't really work like that.
We know this because right before we recorded this episode, we tried some benchmark tests with certain eyes closed and nothing changed.
Nothing changed.
And that was...
So for us, at least, we don't have split brains, it seems. But
so stupid.
so stupid. But to be fair, when you're reading this book, it's like, it makes you feel like there's this crazy divide happening.
I know.
And it's just, not to say it's exaggerated, but, he says, if you were to buy a car, if you were to look at two different cars, they have millions of things more in common than they have different. They both have engines. They both have four wheels. They're both a car. They're both similar shape. But it's the differences that matter for what you actually purchase.
Right.
And so keep in mind that they still are more similar than they are different.
Yeah.
The right hemisphere and the left hemisphere do so many similar things. They interface in so many different things. He just thinks we need to examine the differences.
Yeah, it's insane. And I think we have one more passage to read. I think it would be a good time to get to it because it is still about language and it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Another pretty banger line from this guy, man. He doesn't stop. This
was one of my favorite. It's kind of going off metaphor a little, but again, it's talking about language and the shortcomings of language. Let me emphasize that the gap across which the metaphor carries us is one that language itself creates. Metaphor is language's cure for the ills entailed on us by language, much as, I believe, the true process of philosophy is to cure the ills entailed on us by philosophizing.
I mean, it's just, this guy doesn't quit.
That was a little almost tangent introed in that,
right, into the kind of his philosophy about philosophy.
But I think the link here, which is he's saying, metaphor is the thing that brings in the context that we lose through language. And the issue is that because we place so much value on language, everything is language. This podcast is language. How we interface with everyone in the world seemingly is language. Obviously, there's body language, there's emotion, there's all these things that go on under, but the value is placed on language. That creates a serious problem of losing the context, of losing the life. And metaphor is the cure for that.
Yeah.
And philosophy, I think what he's saying here is philosophizing, thinking about things, trying to break them down into all these understandable aspects of human behavior, understandable how the world came to be. You lose a lot.
Yeah. And there's this very interesting study they did with, I don't think it was split brain patients. I think they were just turning off and on parts of their brain, which they can do. It was with philosophical premises, and one was blatantly untrue. It was all monkeys can climb trees, porcupines are monkeys, and then therefore, porcupines can climb trees. Right. And they would turn off someone's right hemisphere and then ask them, what is this? Or parts of their right hemisphere, whatever the part is that they use for this. I don't know. And they would say yeah, this is true. Well, it says it right here. This is true. And then they would turn off the parts of their left hemisphere. They'd be like, well, no, I know that monkeys aren't porcupines or porcupines aren't monkeys. So this is I know that it's saying this, but I know this is wrong. And so that was crazy because it was basically whenever we approach things with the left hemisphere view, it's oh, well, it's written down. It must be true. It's right there. I understand, there's no sense of the context to it.
Right.
And so philosophy at some level is always going to be removed from the context because that's the whole idea of philosophy, is that we're kind of breaking down these universal facts about the world that we can base in logic that isn't inherently baked into the world, and that we're never going to be able to philosophically understand certain things just because it's not going to ever get there. There's too much paradox, there's too much, it just doesn't work. It's
not going to fit neatly into a bunch of boxes. And this brings me to kind of a question I have for you, because with some of the things we've read, like Tiny Habits and Good Energy and whatever, we said this before, we love a framework, and kind of the point of this podcast is to build out these frameworks that we can then apply to different situations and live by and help other people live by. Is that condemning us to just missing the full picture of things? Are we losing the nuance when we go into a framework? It's awesome to have this set of guidelines that you live by, but is that inherently causing us to think about things in almost a fundamentally too left-brained of a way?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and for a lot of reasons that have been interestingly shown to me throughout this book. So the first thing I'll say is that there's this interesting idea that he talks about in this book that we tend to mimic and follow behaviors that we see in others or what we pay attention to. It's like we kind of start to gravitate in a direction. And in this podcast, we spent a lot of time, let's break down meaning, fulfillment. It seems like we're kind of positioning ourselves as these, like, we're not there yet. And that seems like we're just gonna gravitate into this state of like a we're not there yet state. Whereas, people who are probably very fulfilled, they don't think about like, how can I make myself feel fulfilled today? They just do something that is inherently like fulfilling to them. So I think it's this interesting like the consideration to have where it's like, okay, what kind of stuff do we want to surround ourselves with? And will that be in any way limiting to our ultimate success? So that's the first thing that I'm like, this is worth considering. And the second thing I would say is that I feel like whenever we do approach these kind of problems one at a time, like we're trying to be pretty holistic here. And I don't think that we're doing a bad job at kind of approaching some pretty big problems in holistic ways, right? Like we're not getting super hyper specialized, we're not getting super biohacky, and I think that's a good thing. Now, we did do like, our blood work, and we're being very, aggressive on like macro tracking and like sleep tracking. We have like health wearables. Now, I do think that these can kind of create more of these like ideas and concepts versus being where we're starting to quantify and put labels on things that we never had to think about before. And this might lead to a little bit more of a left brain way of life, which might not be great. And I would love to transition out of using those, but this is like, I think, a key part of another kind of idea he gives in this book, which is our skills and our development of skills. When we have to learn how to do something, like if we're learning to play a piece of music on the piano, at first when we hear the music, it's a very right-brained experience. It's music, it's new, it's all going in there. And then once we start to like listen and we start to learn how to play it, it becomes very left-brain. We're very isolating and practicing and really getting into it. And so it's a lot different experience. But then eventually, once you've mastered the piece, you no longer need to be so hyper focused on it and your attention can kind of widen. And so all of a sudden it becomes more unconscious and more of a right brain experience, even though it might be still baked into the left side of your brain or wherever your skills really go to. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the whole idea is that we have to become hyper vigilant and hyper aware and focused on things when we're improving them. And then after there's kind of like a curve, and then all of a sudden they become unconscious again. And so my hope is that while we do these deep dives into things, we can really become hyper conscious of them for a brief enough time to where they can then become unconscious again, and we can go on living, great lives in a very like I don't have to think about it anymore. And this is something that we want to, I guess, another goal of us on this podcast is we want to take these things and we want to be hyper focused on them to then hopefully deliver information and resources to others so that it doesn't, that curve is quicker, or that, it's a lot less time needed to kind of worry about it. And it's a lot more of the kind of framework of like, okay, I don't need to be so caught up in my issues or so caught up in my numbers. It's more of like okay, this should work.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you were talking about that, one thing I thought of was it's this means to an end of let's hyper focus on something like health or sleep or exercise so that then, like you said, it can become more unconscious. Mm-hmm. But you can risk being caught up in almost a sub goal and then optimizing strictly for the sub goal. Mm-hmm. And I think about that with fulfillment of oftentimes we go into the world with this idea that let me get the resources and the money I need so that then I can live the passions I want to live and the life I want to live later in life. Mm-hmm. But then it just becomes about the money. Like we lose sight of the original goal that was why we started the mission in the first place. And we just pivot towards maximizing the sub goal that was supposed to get us there. And now 30 years later, we're locked into this job that we don't even like or whatever. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Master and His Emissary
It's crazy
story.
how all this stuff is so analogous to this story through our brain functions, then our kind of our life functions. It's
crazy because
weird.
again, it gets a little like, what's going on here? The emissary who's just focused on fulfilling the tasks that the master is giving him, what happens is they do it to such a good extent that they think that they start to know more and that their goal is more important. And so then they want to overtake the master, but they've lost sight of the overarching goal that the master had in the first place.
Yeah.
It's probably good that we're reading this now because I think it's going to be a really good reminder as we go through the podcast, where it's like, there's a lot of things like as we try and get more viewership, let's not let the viewership become the primary goal. Let's still, like, if that was the goal so that we could accumulate more following and community and resources so that we could then help more people, let's not forget that it was all so that we could help more people in the long run.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, easy to do very easy to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is. And it's easy to also, I think, get caught up in kind of our like quest for doing better in our own lives and, not losing sight of, with the challenges, losing sight of the result. And it kind of becomes more of the challenge kind of mindset. And I think I heard Tony Robbins say something about this where he was like saying how much he hated the like self-help movement because he's like, a lot of the self-help movement is just making it worse because when you're focusing so much on just helping yourself all the time, you're not actually getting anywhere. You're actually making your life worse. And he says that you need to really focus on like the pull from other sources into like, what actually motivates you to do stuff. And that's a whole nother topic for another day. But the idea from that, if we get too caught up in our own lives and what we're doing, and we're in a slippery slope here with our challenges because it's very like document all of our stuff. But if we're able to keep the frame of reference as far as the whys we're doing it and those types of things, I think that we stand a chance. And it'll be very beneficial, hopefully, to 10 plus people.
Yeah, and I think what we have going for us is that we're incorporating things like the Untethered Soul, which is a meditation practice, which is trying to quiet or not identify as much with the constant voice in your head, almost that left hemisphere representation of the world. And so we're taking things not just from let's segment all of our lives out into sleep. Like, we understand that this is a very interconnected process and that behind all of it is this conscious experience that we're trying to also explore as well.
Yeah. Crazy stuff, huh? So the thoughts, right? And we've talked about this a lot, and I wanted to come back to this because there's a section of the book where he talks about basically our left hemisphere's limited scope, but given that it's the verbal hemisphere, that's kind of where our thoughts are coming from. And so our thoughts are being generated from a limited scope. But another tendency that we have is to really believe what our left hemisphere is saying. And so this has a plethora of problems, and that we've talked about I think we talked about it in Good Energy and the episode where we get into more of the kind of science behind meditation and the thought generation and how this seems to be almost, it's like not really in our control, the automatic thoughts and those things kind of how they pop up and that they're so sure. And so, so there's some interesting studies here. So you want to tell us a little bit about some more split brain stuff? Yeah.
So this is mind blowing. There's a couple of examples that he gives throughout the book, but one of them is with split brain patients where they show, because it's literally a split brain and the right hemisphere controls the left eye, left hemisphere the right, you can show one hemisphere an image without showing the other hemisphere.
It's crazy.
Which is wild to think about. But what they would do is they would show the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere two separate images. And they would have a bunch of cards that had more images on them.
A lot of pictures going on.
A lot of pictures going on. But they would ask okay, you see an image, pick up the card that matches with this image, right? So the example he gives is they would show a picture of the snow to the right hemisphere and say, and it would show maybe a picture of a chicken
or like I think it was like a claw of
or
a chicken.
a chicken claw to the left hemisphere. And they would ask like, okay, with your hands, pick up the images that correspond.
Yeah.
And so with the left hand, which is corresponded to the one that saw the snow, the right hemisphere, they would pick up a shovel.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Right.
And with the right hand, which is corresponding to the left hemisphere, saw the claw, they would pick up a chicken.
Yeah.
Right? Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
But when asked, why did you pick up the shovel and why did you pick up the chicken? The left hemisphere, which verbalizes the thought and only saw the claw, would say, well, I picked up a chicken because it goes with the claw, and I picked up the shovel because you use a shovel to clean out a chicken coop.
Yeah.
Right? It made up a reason for picking up the shovel.
And it was like, sure.
And it was sure.
It's important to say that the snow shovel thing, they did this, they did it before where they didn't show like a chicken and they would basically pick up the shovel. So it's not like they weren't actually ever picking up the shovel.
They confirmed that it was because of the snow.
Yes.
And I mean, another example that's maybe a little simpler, I think we heard this on another podcast, but you could do something where you could show the right hemisphere text that would say, go to the other room and grab this glass of water. And then the person would get up, they'd grab the glass of water because they just read this thing. But the left hemisphere never saw it. So when they asked, why'd you grab the glass of water? They would say something like, oh, well, I was thirsty. It would make up a reason, even though the other brain just
and
read.
This is crazy. And it's crazy that like with the split brain, like they could show things to the right hemisphere and they wouldn't be able to think, they wouldn't know that they saw it, right? They weren't consciously aware that they saw this, but yet they somehow have some like intuitive understanding of what they saw and like translate it. And so that's crazy.
It really makes you wonder like how much of what I think is just post,
right?
Like rationalization.
I would say probably most of it.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of, again, our left hemisphere. It's like we're representing the world, and that's where our thoughts are. Our thoughts are coming from this represented world of ideas instead of things. And this is like so just, I feel like so important. This is to understand and to be able to see within yourself that these are not like the truth and these are not absolutes. And it's so easy to get so worried and so caught up in things that even haven't even happened yet.
Yeah.
This is all about, Untethered Soul and Living Untethered and so many other books.
Yeah. And
it's just crazy how it's now like in the neuroscience, they're like, yeah, it's basically like this limited scope of our brains is what's generating these thoughts to begin with. And that's like what we think is true and real.
When you think about the implications of that on your own life, it's huge from the sense of this is significant reason to doubt the thoughts that I have in what I would say a very positive way. Because it's not that you're lying to yourself. It's like, your right hemisphere is catching all these things and your left hemisphere is, coming up with reasons for why things are happening.
It's really trying its hardest.
It's giving it its best go and it has value, but it's going to come up with a reason no matter what. This links to a whole other thing that I think is interesting, which is this sense of survivorship bias, which is, if you ever talk to or you listen to a podcast with a really successful person and you ask them, how'd you get to where you got, they're going to give you a formula that they followed and tell you to follow the same thing. And it's not to say that they don't have amazing advice to share, but it is to say that everyone, and this is the left hemisphere, goes through life and then looks back with 20/20 hindsight vision and explains how they got to where they got. They don't take into account the fact that, they got lucky here. They just happened to meet this random person or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy to look back and rationalize all of our decisions and rationalize all of our actions and come up with reasons.
Yeah, especially because we seem to have a tendency to want to think that we have control or influence over the world. So we're going to be naturally biased towards being, oh, well, I tried really hard or I did this or that. When in reality, probably most of the time it is just luck.
Yeah, I mean, luck plays a huge role. And the question that it does bring up for me is almost this identity crisis of, okay, going back to the Untethered Soul, right? You're not the thoughts Maybe this is good, more reason to believe that he says you're the conscious awareness of all these things, which is kind of the right hemisphere contextual understanding. But am I that either? Am I some amalgamation of the two? Like who we opened an episode with Who Are We a few episodes back. And it brings us back to this, like,
what are...
It's like we're like this between the hemispheres, the combination, neither. Like, am I my right hemisphere? It just feels so strange and foreign to think about and kind of uncomfortable.
It's weird. And it's also weird because he talks about, it's almost that we have, in split brain patients, they almost had two separate like consciousnesses going on in either side of their brains, because it's like their hemispheres were projecting and coming up with their own stories.
Yeah.
And this might even be happening to some level.
I think it is. I think he says
brains.
kind of in one of the latter chapters that we read, is like there's evidence to show that the two hemispheres can have different wills, different goals. And
so there's this like weird power struggle happening in our minds, but it's not like we can... It's not like it's black and white in one and then in color in the other where we can obviously tell the difference. It's like, how does that work? Like, if I sometimes like, oh, I'm acting really left brain right now, or like, oh, I'm really in the right brain zone, and am I actually transitioning between states?
I mean, it's almost like, I imagine like if you were playing video games and it was like you and your friend were like arguing over who had the controller, and like one of you had one half and one of you had the other, and then the character, somebody kept winning out. It depended. There was trade off, and that's what the character would do. It's like you wouldn't say that the character's in control or that you're the character,
right?
But like. So it's like, if you're the character in that analogy, then
you're just going
with whatever's happening in this kind of battle. And it's like, am I...
Yeah, there's a lot of like really free will, like what is going on there in the even more insane sense than I had ever previously considered, I think.
Right.
Like, I think philosophically we could break down free will in a sense, but this is a lot more of like a what... Like, what is even like my free will of like,
is it, do I have free will, or do my hemispheres have free will, and are those mutually exclusive?
And what am I in all of this? I don't know.
Yeah.
We're just floating around somewhere and something, but he gives like an explanation of kind of where our consciousness is kind of like from the ground up in our brains. And I'm going to be honest, like, I really, this part kind of went didn't really get processed in there. I don't know. I mean,
don't throw it on me.
It seems like it's kind of permeates our brain, but is also like a very small part of it. But that doesn't mean that it's not us. It's like we're also mostly the unconscious part of our brain.
Right, because this is the thing. It's like that sentence alone feels so almost paradoxical.
Right.
Which is to be the unconscious part of our brain, or the subconscious, or, which I think there's plenty good arguments for so much going on in our subconscious mind. How is that me though?
Right.
Am I just the consciousness and therefore not really in control at all? Like
you could just say that, like, what if 95% of your actions are just the unconscious part of your brain? What are you in that, right? Like, are you just watching your
just
unconscious
the experiencer
brain
of this with zero control, or almost next to none, or... I don't know.
And maybe what's happening here is we're running into a little bit of a language barrier. Huh? This is what happens when you try to left hemispherize.
Not a word. No, turn it into a verb. I think that's good.
Hemispherize?
Yeah, why not?
I kind of like it.
Yeah, go for it. Left hemispherize. It's terrible. And this is staying in.
For the record, I did know that wasn't a word before I said it. I just wanted to see how cool it would sound to say it.
Of course.
Not my best.
Not your best.
Not my best off the dome.
We'll blame it on the left
word.
hemisphere.
Yeah. We'll blame it on the language.
Yeah,
man.
yeah. But no, I think you're right in the sense that our attempt to break down what's happening with language, we're gonna miss a lot of.
It's
what's
almost
actually
like we just have to. Yeah. It's like we can kind of feel that we're there. Maybe that's all the evidence we need. We don't need to somehow explain it because we can't. So let's maybe just stick with what we can do and just kind of be like, yeah, I'm in there. At least I feels like it.
Yeah, I think he said at one point, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. The footnote was, it should maybe even be just, I feel, therefore I am.
Yeah, but then the even more correct version is, I am, therefore I am.
Which, I mean, come on.
Where is that getting us? Like, that feels like we've gotten nowhere.
But it reminds me, you know what that reminds me of? Now we're just looping on tangents here, but that reminds me of, we listened to a talk recently from Eckhart Tolle, who said he's talking about God and some translations of the Bible, and his favorite understanding of kind of God and being and consciousness was, I am the I am. There you go.
There you go. That's a thing.
Yeah.
It was said way back when. And now it's being said again on Learning to Live episode 11.
Yeah, where we're doing a fantastic job of breaking this down. I mean, here's the thing. I think the cool part about this book, to try and bring it all back together.
All right, let's
close the door. Conclusion. There is so much in this book that we've discussed in this episode that is being explained by this tension between left and right hemisphere. Part 2, which should tell us a little bit more on what's happening from a societal level. It's a little bit more philosophical, so we'll see how well we can process that. But
we're going to be so lost.
It also, I think, gives a little bit more guidance on what to do in the face of this information. The core takeaways for me is that with this approach, this difference of approach, I almost just simply come back to this idea of the left hemisphere being this representation of this world, this way to manipulate, this way to control, and the right hemisphere being the whole. And you need the value of language, and you need the value of manipulation to act in this world.
Yeah.
But the more we can step back, the more we can not just identify with those thoughts as true and just let them be thoughts and gain utility from them where there is utility to be gained, but approach life from the whole, the more we are acting in accordance with the master as opposed to maybe the overconfident emissary.
Yes.
It was fun to go through this episode because I think a lot of themes came up, just things like, success bias or how the Western medicine and good energy is so specialized, how we can even start to see manifestations of these things in so many different realms. So it's going to be super helpful grounding for the topics we cover in future episodes, which is awesome. But it's more of just like a greater approach that I think is my main takeaway so far. And we're only halfway through the book.
Yeah, on a broader scale, I would say that my main takeaway is definitely that it could all just come together in our brains in a really crazy way. And this is like spiritual experience amongst, everything. It seems like our brain is just, it's all there.
Yeah.
But I would say my more impactful takeaway of like I guess interesting, like I hadn't really thought about it that way specifically, would be the more we focus on things like thinking or the representations of the world, the more lifeless they become just inherently.
Right.
And that was something that I didn't really like. We talked about it in, the Living Untethered. It's like, oh, well, you're too busy being in your thoughts, not in the real world. But the fact that our brain is literally having this like emotionless, lifelessness approach to that kind of focus in those things, like it literally is lifeless and mechanical and broken down whenever we start to engage in that is kind of like is even more motivation to like during the meditation and during just life, paying less attention to your thoughts and paying more attention to like your body, your feelings, your gut reactions, what's around you, your broader sense of attention and awareness. And those are the kinds of things that actually bring us into living.
Yeah.
And now I got to go listen to like poetry and classical music because that seems to really take us there.
Yeah. And so, maybe that'll be something we look into further. But
poetry challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great way to kind of sum up what we've learned so far. So what's coming next week? Well, this is a big book, and we don't quite think we're going to be able to do it justice if we just try and cram it into a week and get to part 2. So that'll be 2 weeks down the line. We're coming with part 2 of The Master and His Emissary, and we'll tie the bow on this. In between, we'll look at a challenge check-in, because now we're into the good energy challenge where we've completely overhauled the diet. So it's going to be super exciting to talk about that. We've done a lot more meditation since the last time we talked. So it'll be super exciting to talk about that. And then obviously the challenges that started at the beginning of this podcast, the phone challenge, the tiny habits challenge. We'll do the comprehensive check-in.
Yeah.
So that's next week. Master and His Emissary the week after that. And then we'll keep the ball rolling.
Yeah. So should be fun. And hopefully we're going to experiment with a little bit more spicing up the challenge check-in. Hopefully we'll come out with a little more of a fresh approach into it and get us started on maybe what can be a more of a repeatable framework for going over that.
Yeah, and maybe that's just our left hemisphere talking, but
right.
I think something we really want from these challenges is to be able to build on something and really showcase what's changing. Should you actually be doing this? And we didn't feel like we nailed that on our first episode because it was more just our thoughts on what was going on. We want to really be able to dissect the progress or the lack of progress that we've made in these areas. So it should be a lot of fun. It should be very exciting.
Yes. So until next week, we will be more book.
More big book, lots of words.
Goody.
It is straining the brain a little, but it's a good strain.
Yes.
Good strain.
Yes. I would recommend reading this book 100%. If you have weeks to kill.
Yeah, for context, because we've listened to parts of a lot of the books that we've done on audiobook and gone between reading as well. Untethered Soul, Living Untethered, 6 hours each on audiobook, killed that in a couple days.
Yeah.
28 hours. So it's... Yeah.
No, I think I read The Untethered Soul in like a day.
Yeah.
And then less than a day. And then this,
So yeah, it's a lot. But
it's dense too.
If you are to read a book this dense, the writing is so phenomenal. It's not like reading a textbook.
No.
A little like reading a textbook, but way better still.
It's like reading a beautifully written textbook.
Yeah, where they tried to make it almost sound like poetry.
Right.
All right, well, thank you so much for listening.
Yeah.
And excited for next week.
Yeah, let us know how left-brained you are.
Yes.
Or how right-brained you are. But I don't see how you could do that because you wouldn't be able to type.